What happens when a man discovers that his greatest victim is also his greatest love? Tonight, we dive into one of the most haunting stories from the American South. A tale that will make you question everything you think you know about family, duty, and the price of survival. Don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell. This story will leave you speechless, and you won't want to miss what comes next. Some sins are inherited, others are chosen. The Mississippi air hung thick and oppressive on that October night of 1847, carrying with it the scent of decay from the river and the weight of unspoken horrors. Magnolia plantations stretched endlessly under the pale moonlight, its cotton fields like white ghosts swaying in the humid breeze. But tonight, the real ghosts were the living. Harlan Blackwood stood at the river's edge, his leather boots sinking slightly into the muddy bank. At 28, he was a man carved from stone and cruelty. Tall, broad-shouldered, with piercing grey eyes that had long ago learned to see enslaved people as nothing more than property to be managed. His white shirt, rolled up to the elbows, was already stained with river water and something darker. The plantation house loomed behind him like a monument to Southern aristocracy, its white columns gleaming in the moonlight. From its windows, warm yellow light spilled onto the manicured gardens where magnolia trees bloomed in defiance of the season's approaching end. It was a picture of genteel civilization, a facade that masked the brutality that funded its existence. Harlan had grown up in the shadow of that house, raised by his mother, Elena Blackwood, who had served as the plantation's head housekeeper until her death 5 years prior. She had been a woman of mysterious origins, beautiful and educated beyond her station, with secrets that she carried to her grave. The other servants whispered that she had been Master Witmore's father's mistress, but such talk was dangerous and quickly silenced. "Bring the next one," he commanded, his voice cutting through the night air like a blade. The water ordeal was Harlan's own invention, a punishment he had perfected over his 5 years as head overseer. It was simple, efficient, and left no marks that would decrease the plantation's property value. The accused would be forced to stand waist-deep in the murky Mississippi, hands bound behind their back, while Harlan determined their guilt or innocence. The guilty, or those he simply disliked, would be pushed under until the river claimed them. The innocent would be allowed to return to their quarters, forever marked by the terror of nearly drowning. The method had earned him a reputation throughout the county as a man who could maintain order without damaging valuable property. Other plantation owners often consulted him on matters of discipline, and he took pride in his innovative approach to slave management. What they didn't know was that Harlan had developed the technique after watching his predecessor Marcus Grimm beat a pregnant woman to death with a bullwhip. The sight of her broken body had disturbed something deep within him, not enough to make him question the system, but enough to seek cleaner methods of control. Tonight's offense was theft. Someone had taken food from the plantation's storehouse. Master Cornelius Witmore had given Harlan carte blanche to find the culprit, and Harlan had decided that examples needed to be made. The missing food was worth perhaps 50 cents, but the principle was everything. Allow one theft to go unpunished, and soon the entire plantation would descend into chaos. 19 souls had already been claimed by the dark water. 19 men and women who had families, dreams, and stories that would never be told. Their bodies had been swept away by the current, becoming food for the catfish and alligators that lurked in the depths. Among the dead was young Marcus, barely 16, who had been accused of stealing because he had been seen near the storehouse. His crime was being in the wrong place at the wrong time, but Harlan had long ago stopped distinguishing between guilt and suspicion. There was also old Betty, a woman in her 70s who had raised 3 generations of children on the plantation. Her only crime was defending Marcus, insisting that the boy was innocent. Harlan had silenced her protests by sending her to join him in the river's embrace. Each death had been methodical, calculated. Harlan would force the accused into the water, watch as they struggled against their bonds, and then make his judgment based on criteria known only to himself. Sometimes he would spare someone on a whim, enjoying the power of life and death that coursed through his veins like a drug. Other times, he would condemn the innocent simply to maintain the atmosphere of terror that kept the plantation running smoothly. "Please, Massa Harlan," whispered Sarah, a young woman barely 18, as two other overseers dragged her toward the water. "I got a baby. I ain't steal nothing. I swear on my mama's grave." Sarah worked in the big house, cleaning and serving meals to the Witmore family. She was known for her gentle nature and her beautiful singing voice, which often echoed through the halls as she went about her duties. Her baby, little Thomas, was only 6 months old, and she had been nursing him when the overseers came to drag her away. The child's cries still echoed from the slave quarters, where he had been left in the care of other women. Harlan's expression didn't change. He had heard these pleas countless times before. They meant nothing to him, less than the buzzing of mosquitoes in his ear. "Everyone says they're innocent, Sarah," he replied coldly, adjusting the coiled whip at his side. "The river will tell us the truth." The whip was a work of art, crafted by the finest leather workers in New Orleans. Its handle was carved from ebony and inlaid with silver, a gift from Master Witmore when Harlan had first been promoted to head overseer. He had used it to discipline hundreds of slaves over the years, and its leather was stained dark with blood and sweat. As Sarah was forced into the water, her sobs echoing across the plantation, Harlan felt the familiar surge of power that came with absolute control over life and death. This was his domain, his kingdom of fear and submission. He was judge, jury, and executioner, and he wore those roles like a crown. But power, Harlan would soon learn, was a double-edged sword that could cut its wielder just as deeply as its victims. The other enslaved people stood in a line along the bank, forced to watch as their friends and family members disappeared beneath the surface. Their faces were masks of terror and resignation, expressions Harlan had seen so many times they no longer registered as human to him. Among them were children as young as 10, elderly men and women who could barely stand, and pregnant women whose swollen bellies spoke of new life that might never see freedom. The watching crowd included Mama Celia, an elderly woman who served as the unofficial spiritual leader of the slave community. Her weathered hands clutched a small wooden cross, and her lips moved in silent prayer as each person was led to their death. Beside her stood Big Jim, a massive man whose strength was legendary throughout the county, but who now stood helpless as his friends and family were murdered before his eyes. Among them stood an older man, perhaps in his 50s, with graying hair and hands scarred from decades of hard labor. His name was Samuel. Though Harlan didn't know it, Samuel had been on the plantation for over 30 years, arriving as a young man and watching as generations of his people lived and died under the whip. He had survived by keeping his head down, working hard, and never giving the overseers cause to notice him. Samuel's eyes, however, held something different from the others. Where they showed fear, his showed a deep, abiding sadness, not for himself, but for the young man standing in the river, dealing out death with the casual indifference of someone swatting flies. There was something familiar about the overseer's profile, something that stirred memories Samuel had tried to bury for decades. As Sarah's struggles grew weaker and finally stopped, Harlan felt nothing. No remorse, no satisfaction, just the cold efficiency of a job well done. He had been trained well by his predecessor, old Marcus Grimm, who had taught him that mercy was weakness, and that the only way to maintain order was through absolute terror. Grimm had been a monster in the truest sense, a man who took pleasure in inflicting pain and who had turned cruelty into an art form. Under his tutelage, Harlan had learned to suppress his natural empathy, to see enslaved people as livestock rather than human beings. The transformation had been gradual but complete, and by the time Grimm died of a heart attack 3 years ago, Harlan had become everything his mentor had hoped for. "Next," Harlan called out, wiping his hands on his pants. The line of condemned moved forward, like cattle to slaughter, each person knowing that their chances of survival depended entirely on the whims of a man who had forgotten how to feel human emotion. The night air was filled with the sound of weeping and prayer, creating a symphony of despair that would have moved any heart that still retained its humanity. But fate, it seemed, had other plans for Harlan Blackwood. As the night wore on and the body count rose, storm clouds began to gather overhead. The wind picked up, causing the Spanish moss to dance like hanged men from the ancient oak trees that lined the plantation. Lightning flickered in the distance, illuminating the scene in brief, stark moments that made it look like something from a nightmare. The approaching storm seemed to mirror the darkness in Harlan's soul, as if nature itself was responding to the evil being perpetrated on its banks. The air grew heavy with the promise of rain, and the temperature dropped noticeably, causing the survivors to shiver as they waited their turn to face judgment. Harlan paid no attention to the weather. He was focused entirely on his work, methodically working his way through the line of suspects. Each death was calculated, each drowning timed to maximize the psychological impact on the survivors. He had learned that the threat of death was often more effective than death itself, and he used the executions to reinforce the absolute nature of his authority. By the time he reached the 19th victim, an elderly woman named Ruth, who had been accused of hiding stolen cornbread, Harlan was beginning to feel the first stirrings of fatigue. Not emotional fatigue, for he was incapable of that, but physical weariness from standing in the mud for hours. Ruth had been on the plantation longer than anyone could remember, a fixture in the slave quarters who had delivered babies, tended the sick, and comforted the dying. She was beloved by all who knew her, a grandmother figure who had never shown anything but kindness to those around her. Her accusation was based on nothing more than the word of another slave who hoped to save his own life by pointing fingers. Ruth went under without much of a fight. At 73, she was too old and weak to struggle effectively against the river's embrace. As her body disappeared into the current, Harlan turned to face the remaining suspects. Only one remained. The past has a way of surfacing when we least expect it. The 20th figure stepped forward from the shadows, and for the first time in his adult life, Harlan Blackwood felt his heart skip a beat. The man was tall and dignified, despite his circumstances, with skin the color of rich mahogany and eyes that held decades of wisdom and pain. His hair was more gray than black now, and his face bore the lines of someone who had endured unimaginable hardships with quiet strength. Despite his age and the circumstances, he carried himself with a nobility that seemed to transcend his status as property. Samuel had spent 30 years on Magnolia Plantation, arriving as a young man of 22 after being sold away from his family in Virginia. He had been purchased for his skills as a carpenter and blacksmith, talents that had made him valuable enough to survive when lesser men had been worked to death in the cotton fields. Over the decades, he had built most of the outbuildings on the plantation, forged the tools that kept the operation running, and trained younger slaves in the trades that might keep them alive. But it was those eyes, deep brown, flecked with gold, that stopped Harlan cold. They were his own eyes, staring back at him across the years, The recognition hit Harlan like a physical blow, memories flooding back from the deepest recesses of his mind. He remembered being 5 years old, hiding behind his mother's skirts as she spoke in hushed tones with a tall, dark-skinned man who worked in the plantation's forge. He remembered the way the man's eyes had lit up when he saw Harlan, the gentle way he had spoken to the boy, and the sadness that had clouded his features when Eleanor had hurriedly pulled her son away. "No," Harlan whispered, the word escaping his lips before he could stop it. The man, Samuel, looked directly at him for the first time that night. There was no hatred in his gaze, no anger or fear. Instead, there was something infinitely worse, recognition, and a love that had never died, despite everything that had happened. Samuel had watched his son grow up from a distance, stealing glimpses whenever he could. He had seen the boy's first steps, heard his first words, and witnessed his transformation from an innocent child into the monster who now stood before him. Every day for 23 years, Samuel had carried the weight of knowing that his blood ran in the veins of the plantation's most feared overseer. "Hello, son," Samuel said quietly, his voice carrying across the water like a prayer. The words hung in the air like a curse, and Harlan felt the world tilt on its axis. Around him, the other overseers and enslaved people watched in confusion as their seemingly unshakable tormentor stood frozen, staring at the man in the water. Tom Bradley, Harlan's second in command, shifted nervously beside him. Bradley was a crude man from the Georgia backwoods, hired more for his willingness to use violence than for any particular skill. He had always resented serving under someone younger than himself, and he sensed that something significant was happening, though he couldn't understand what. The whip fell from Harlan's nerveless fingers, landing in the mud with a wet slap. The sound seemed to echo in the sudden silence, and several of the watching slaves exchanged glances of amazement. They had never seen their overseer show any sign of weakness or uncertainty. Harlan's mind reeled, memories flooding back like a dam had burst inside his skull. He was 5 years old again, hiding behind his mother's skirts as she argued with Master Witmore's father in hushed, desperate tones. He remembered fragments of conversation, words like bastard, scandal, and reputation. He remembered his mother's tears and the way she had held him close that night, whispering that his father had to go away, but that he loved him very much. Harlan Blackwood had been a woman of extraordinary beauty and intelligence, qualities that had caught the attention of both the plantation's master and one of his most skilled slaves. The affair with Samuel had been brief but passionate, resulting in a pregnancy that threatened to destroy them all. When Harlan was born, his mixed heritage was not immediately obvious. His skin was pale enough to pass for white, and his features could be explained away as Mediterranean or perhaps Native American. But as he grew older, certain characteristics became more pronounced. His hair had a slight curl to it that no amount of pomade could completely straighten. His lips were fuller than those of most white children, and his nose had a breadth that spoke of African ancestry. Most telling of all were his eyes, the same golden-brown eyes that now stared back at him from his father's face. "You're supposed to be dead," Harlan managed to choke out, his voice barely audible above the sound of the river. Samuel smiled sadly, the expression transforming his weathered features. "I've been dead to you for 23 years, boy, but I've been right here, watching you grow up, watching you become..." He paused, his voice breaking slightly. "Watching you become this." The truth hit Harlan like a physical blow. All these years, his father had been here, on the same plantation, living as property while his son wielded the whip. Samuel had watched from the fields as Harlan learned to read and write, as he was trained in the arts of cruelty and control. He had seen his boy transform from an innocent child into a monster, and he had been powerless to stop it. Samuel remembered the day when 5-year-old Harlan had wandered into the forge where he worked. The boy had been fascinated by the glowing metal and the shower of sparks, and Samuel had shown him how to work the bellows and shape the hot iron. For a brief, shining moment, father and son had worked together, and Samuel had dared to dream of a different future. But Elena had found them there and had flown into a panic. She had dragged Harlan away, scolding him for bothering the slaves, and Samuel had never been allowed to be alone with his son again. From that day forward, he had been forced to watch from a distance as the boy he loved was shaped into something he could barely recognize. "I didn't know," Harlan said, though even as the words left his mouth, he realized how hollow they sounded. "I thought you were dead. Mother said you were dead. Your mother did what she had to do to protect you," Samuel replied, taking a step deeper into the water. "Master Witmore's father would have killed us both if the truth had come out, a white woman and a slave. It was a death sentence for all of us." The water was cold against Samuel's legs, but he barely noticed. He had been preparing for this moment for years, knowing that eventually the truth would surface. He had watched his son become everything he had prayed he would never become, and he had carried the guilt of that transformation like a stone in his chest. Elena had made Samuel promise to stay away from their son, to let the boy believe that his father was dead rather than risk exposure. She had convinced herself that it was better for Harlan to grow up thinking he was white, to have the privileges and opportunities that came with that status. But Samuel had seen the cost of that deception in the man his son had become. The other overseers were beginning to murmur among themselves, sensing that something significant was happening, but not understanding what. Tom Bradley stepped forward with a confused expression, his hand instinctively moving to the pistol at his hip. "Boss, what's going on? You know this one." Harlan couldn't answer. His throat felt like it was closing up, and his hands were shaking uncontrollably. For the first time since childhood, tears threatened to spill from his eyes. The carefully constructed walls around his heart were beginning to crack, and 23 years of suppressed emotion threatened to come pouring out. Samuel continued speaking, his voice gentle despite the circumstances. "I've watched you every day for 23 years, Harlan. I've seen you in the fields, giving orders, using that whip. I've watched you become everything I prayed you'd never become." The pain in Samuel's voice was evident to everyone present. This was not just a slave speaking to his master, but a father confronting the monster his son had become. The other enslaved people in the line began to understand what was happening, and several of them gasped in shock and recognition. Mama Celia, standing near the back of the group, suddenly understood why Samuel had always seemed so interested in the young overseer's activities. She remembered conversations they had shared over the years, Samuel's cryptic comments about blood and responsibility, and his insistence that even the worst sinner could find redemption if they truly sought it. "Stop," Harlan whispered, but Samuel pressed on. "I've seen you kill good people, son, people with families, with children who loved them. I've watched you drown mothers and fathers, brothers and sisters, and every time I've died a little more inside, knowing that my blood runs in your veins." The weight of Samuel's words crashed over Harlan like a tidal wave. Every face of every person he had killed flashed before his eyes. Men and women who had been someone's child, someone's parent, someone's beloved. People who had been just as human as he was, despite what he had been taught to believe. He thought of Marcus, the 16-year-old boy who had died earlier that night, and realized that the youth could have been his own son in different circumstances. He thought of old Betty, who had died defending the boy's innocence, and understood that she had shown more courage and humanity in her final moments than he had displayed in his entire adult life. "I had to," Harlan said desperately, his voice cracking. "It was my job. It was what I was supposed to do." "No, son," Samuel said firmly. his voice carrying the authority of a father speaking to his child. It was what you chose to do. Every time you raised that whip, every time you pushed someone under this water, you made a choice, and now you have to live with those choices. Thunder rumbled overhead, and the first drops of rain began to fall, mixing with the tears that Harlan could no longer hold back. The carefully constructed walls around his heart were crumbling, and 23 years of suppressed emotion came pouring out like water through a broken dam. The rain began to fall harder, washing the blood and mud from the riverbank, but doing nothing to cleanse the stain on Harlan's soul. Lightning flashed across the sky, illuminating the scene in stark black and white, like a photograph of Judgment Day. "I'm sorry," he sobbed, falling to his knees in the mud. "God help me, I'm so sorry." But Samuel was already walking deeper into the river, the water rising to his chest. His movements were deliberate, purposeful, like a man who had finally found the courage to do what he had been planning for years. "Don't!" Harlan screamed, struggling to his feet. "Please, don't do this." Samuel turned back one last time, and in his eyes Harlan saw not hatred, but profound disappointment, and a love that had endured despite everything. It was the look of a father who had watched his child make terrible choices, but who had never stopped loving him. "I've been carrying this burden for 23 years, Samuel said, his voice barely audible above the sound of the rain and thunder. "Watching my son become a killer, knowing that I couldn't save him or his victims. I can't carry it anymore." The water was up to Samuel's neck now, and he made no effort to fight against the current. Instead, he closed his eyes and let himself sink beneath the surface, disappearing into the dark water that had claimed so many others that night. Some sins are too heavy for one soul to bear. "Stop!" Harlan's voice tore through the night air like a wounded animal's cry, raw and desperate in a way that shocked everyone present. But Samuel had already submerged himself, disappearing beneath the dark surface of the Mississippi. The water closed over his head with barely a ripple, as if the river itself was eager to claim this final victim. The current was strong here, fed by recent rains upstream, and within seconds, any trace of Samuel's presence had been swept away into the darkness. Harlan plunged into the water without thinking, his boots filling with mud as he fought against the current. The river was deeper than it looked, and the bottom was treacherous with hidden roots and debris that had been washed down from plantations upstream. The water was shockingly cold, and the current was stronger than he had anticipated, threatening to sweep him away as well. He dove under, his hands searching desperately through the murky water, but it was like trying to find a ghost. The Mississippi was notorious for claiming bodies and never giving them back, and Harlan knew that his father was already beyond saving. But desperation drove him to keep searching, diving again and again until his lungs burned and his vision began to blur. "Help me!" he screamed at the other overseers who stood frozen on the bank. "Get in here and help me find him!" Tom Bradley and the others exchanged uncertain glances. They had never seen their boss like this, wild-eyed, desperate, completely out of control. The man who had always been a pillar of cold authority was falling apart before their eyes, and they didn't know how to respond. Jake Morrison, the youngest of the overseers, took a tentative step toward the water's edge. He was barely 20, hired more for his willingness to follow orders than for any particular skill or experience. The sight of his usually composed superior thrashing around in the river like a madman was deeply unsettling. "Boss, what's gotten into you?" Tom called out, his voice carrying a note of concern that was unusual for the normally callous man. "He's just another—" "He's my father!" Harlan roared, the words echoing across the plantation like a thunderclap. The admission hung in the air like a curse, and the silence that followed was deafening. Everyone present, overseers and enslaved people alike, stared in shock as the implications sank in. Harlan Blackwood, the most feared overseer in 3 counties, had just revealed that he was the son of a slave. The revelation sent shockwaves through the assembled crowd. The enslaved people looked at each other with expressions of amazement and dawning understanding, while the white overseers struggled to process what they had just heard. In the antebellum South, such an admission was more than scandalous. It was potentially deadly. Mama Celia, standing among the surviving slaves, felt her knees go weak as the pieces of a decades-old puzzle finally fell into place. She remembered Elena Blackwood's mysterious pregnancy, the way the woman had suddenly become reclusive and secretive. She remembered Samuel's strange behavior around the same time, his sudden sadness, and the way he had thrown himself into his work with desperate intensity. "Sweet Jesus," she whispered, her weathered hands clutching her wooden cross. Samuel's boy. All this time it was Samuel's boy. Harlan continued diving, his lungs burning as he searched the river bottom. Each time he came up empty-handed, a piece of his sanity seemed to break away. The water was too dark, too deep, and Samuel's body had already been swept away by the current. The Mississippi was a hungry river, and it rarely gave up its dead. The storm was intensifying now, with lightning flashing across the sky and thunder rolling like artillery fire. The rain was coming down in sheets, turning the riverbank into a muddy quagmire and making it difficult to see more than a few feet in any direction. The wind whipped through the Spanish moss hanging from the ancient oak trees, creating an eerie symphony that seemed to mourn the night's victims. After what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, Harlan finally gave up. He dragged himself onto the muddy bank, collapsing in a heap as the full weight of what had happened crashed down on him. His clothes were soaked through and covered in mud, and his hair hung in wet strands across his face. 20 people were dead by his hand tonight. 20 souls had been sent to their graves because of his cruelty and indifference. And the 20th, the one that mattered most, had chosen to die rather than live in a world where his own son was a monster. 23 years, Harlan whispered to himself, his voice barely audible above the sound of the rain. He was here for 23 years, and I never knew. But that wasn't entirely true, was it? Deep down, in a place he had buried so thoroughly he had forgotten it existed, Harlan had always known. There had been moments over the years when he had caught glimpses of Samuel in the fields, times when something about the older man's bearing or the way he carried himself had seemed familiar. But Harlan had pushed those thoughts away, refusing to acknowledge what his heart was trying to tell him. He remembered now the way Samuel had always seemed to be watching him, the sadness in the older man's eyes whenever their paths crossed. He remembered how Samuel had always been the first to volunteer for the most dangerous jobs, as if he were trying to protect the other slaves from Harlan's wrath. And he remembered the strange dreams he had sometimes had, dreams of a tall, dark-skinned man who spoke to him with love and gentleness. The other overseers were backing away now, uncertain how to handle this revelation. In the antebellum South, the discovery that a white overseer had black blood was more than scandalous. It was potentially deadly. If word got back to Master Witmore, Harlan's life as he knew it would be over. But more than that, the revelation challenged everything they thought they knew about race and hierarchy in their carefully ordered world. Tom Bradley was the first to speak, his voice shaky with uncertainty. "Boss, we need to talk about what just happened here. If this gets out, if people start talking." "Let them talk," Harlan said flatly, not looking up from the mud. "What does it matter now?" But it did matter, and everyone present knew it. The social order of the antebellum South was built on the fiction that racial categories were absolute and immutable. The idea that someone could pass from one race to another, that the boundaries between white and black were not as clear as they pretended, threatened the very foundation of their society. Jake Morrison, the youngest overseer, was staring at Harlan with a mixture of fascination and horror. He had grown up believing that black blood was a kind of contamination, something that could be detected and rooted out. The idea that he had been taking orders from someone with African ancestry for months was deeply disturbing to his worldview. "I don't understand," Jake said, his voice barely above a whisper. "How is this possible? You look white. You act white. How could you be?" "Half-breed," Tom Bradley finished for him, spitting the word like a curse. "That's what he is, a half-breed passing for white." Harlan looked up at them then, and for the first time in years he saw his fellow overseers clearly. They were small, petty men who had built their entire sense of self-worth on the belief that their white skin made them superior to others. The revelation of his mixed heritage threatened that belief, and he could see the fear and confusion in their eyes. But Harlan no longer cared about their opinions or their fears. All he could think about were the faces of the people he had killed, faces that now seemed to merge with his father's in his mind's eye. Each death had been a betrayal of his own blood, a denial of his own humanity. "Get back to your quarters," he told the surviving enslaved people, his voice hollow and broken. "All of you, go." They didn't need to be told twice. Moving quickly but quietly, they melted away into the darkness, leaving Harlan alone with his guilt and his overseers. But as they left, many of them looked back at him with expressions that had changed completely. Where once there had been fear and hatred, now there was something else, pity perhaps, or even a glimmer of hope. Mama Celia was the last to leave, and she paused at the edge of the clearing to look back at the broken man kneeling in the mud. In her eyes, Harlan saw not condemnation, but something that surprised him: compassion. "Samuel always said that blood calls to blood," she said quietly, her voice carrying clearly despite the storm. "Maybe it ain't too late for you to remember who you really are." Then she was gone, disappearing into the night like a ghost, leaving Harlan alone with the weight of her words and the magnitude of his crimes. Tom Bradley approached cautiously, his hand resting on the pistol at his hip. "Boss, we need to talk about what just happened here. If this gets out—" "It won't," Harlan said flatly, not looking up from the mud, "because you're going to forget what you heard tonight. All of you." "But boss—" "I said forget it." Harlan's voice cracked like a whip, and for a moment his old authority reasserted itself. "What happened here tonight stays here. Anyone who says otherwise will answer to me personally." The overseers nodded reluctantly, but Harlan could see the doubt in their eyes. They would keep quiet for now. But rumors had a way of spreading in places like this. It was only a matter of time before the truth came out, and when it did, there would be consequences that none of them could predict or control. As the other men dispersed, Harlan remained by the river, staring out at the dark water that had claimed his father. The rain was falling harder now, washing the blood and mud from his clothes, but doing nothing to cleanse the stain on his soul. Lightning continued to flash across the sky, and thunder rolled like the voice of an angry god. For the first time in his adult life, Harlan Blackwood was truly alone with his conscience, and what he found there terrified him more than anything he had ever faced. The memories came flooding back, not just of tonight, but of all the nights like it, all the people he had killed, all the families he had destroyed, all the lives he had snuffed out with the casual indifference of someone stepping on an ant. Each death had been justified in his mind as necessary, as part of maintaining order and discipline on the plantation. But now, seeing those deaths through his father's eyes, Harlan understood the true magnitude of his crimes. He wasn't just a killer. He was a fratricide, a man who had murdered his own people while believing himself to be their superior. The irony was bitter and complete. Redemption is not given. It must be earned with blood and tears. Master Cornelius Witmore arrived at dawn with 6 armed men, their horses' hooves thundering across the muddy ground like the approach of judgment itself. Harlan watched them come, standing motionless by the river's edge, like a man awaiting execution. The storm had passed during the night, leaving behind a grey, overcast sky that seemed to mirror the desolation in his soul. Witmore was a thin, sharp-faced man in his 50s, with cold blue eyes and the kind of pale skin that never seemed to tan despite years under the southern sun. He dismounted with the fluid grace of someone born to the saddle, his expensive boots squelching in the mud as he approached his overseer. His riding coat was immaculate despite the journey, and his silver-headed cane gleamed in the pale morning light. The plantation owner had built his fortune on the backs of enslaved labor, inheriting a modest operation from his father and expanding it into one of the most profitable plantations in Mississippi. He was known throughout the county as a shrewd businessman and a harsh master, someone who tolerated no challenge to his authority or threats to his property. Behind Witmore rode his personal guard, 6 men chosen for their loyalty and their willingness to use violence without question. They were a rough bunch, recruited from the dregs of Southern society, men who had found purpose and profit in serving the interests of the planter class. Their leader was Jake Morrison's older brother Seth, a scarred veteran of the Mexican War who had never quite adjusted to civilian life. "Harlan," Witmore said, his voice carrying the authority of generations of slave owners, "I've been hearing some very disturbing rumors from the quarters, something about you claiming kinship with one of my property." The news had traveled fast, carried by the network of communication that existed among the enslaved population. Despite the overseer's attempts to keep the revelation secret, word had spread through the slave quarters like wildfire. By morning, every enslaved person on the plantation knew that their most feared tormentor was one of their own. Harlan met his master's gaze without flinching. For the first time in his life, he felt no fear of the man who had controlled his destiny since childhood. What was the worst Witmore could do to him? Kill him. After what he had done, death might be a mercy. "It's true," Harlan said simply, his voice steady despite the turmoil in his heart. Witmore's face went white, then red with rage. The implications of Harlan's admission were staggering, threatening not just the plantation's reputation, but the very foundations of the social order that Witmore represented. "You're telling me that for 5 years, I've had a half-breed giving orders to my slaves, that I've been paying wages to someone who should have been in the fields himself?" The words hit Harlan like physical blows, but he stood his ground. For 28 years, he had lived a lie, believing himself to be something he wasn't. Now, for the first time, he was speaking his truth, and there was a strange liberation in it. "My father was Samuel," Harlan continued, his voice growing stronger with each word. "He's been on this plantation for 30 years, and last night I watched him drown himself rather than live in a world where his son had become a killer." The admission hung in the air like a challenge, and Witmore's men shifted nervously in their saddles. They had come expecting to deal with a slave rebellion, or perhaps a case of theft, not this earth-shattering revelation that threatened to upend everything they thought they knew about race and hierarchy. One of Witmore's men, a brutal enforcer named Jake Morrison, spat in the mud. "Should have known something was off about you, boy. Always thought you were a little too good at understanding how their minds work." Morrison was a product of the Georgia backwoods, a man who had grown up in poverty and had found purpose in serving the planter class. His hatred of enslaved people was matched only by his contempt for anyone who challenged the racial hierarchy that gave his life meaning. Witmore raised a hand for silence, his calculating mind already working through the implications. "This is a disaster," he said quietly. "If word gets out that I've been employing mixed blood as an overseer, my reputation will be ruined. Other planters will question my judgment, my ability to maintain proper order." The social and economic consequences of the revelation were indeed staggering. In the tight-knit world of southern planters, reputation was everything. A man who couldn't properly identify and control his own workforce would be seen as weak and incompetent, potentially losing business relationships and social standing that had taken generations to build. "Then I'll leave," Harlan said. "Tonight, you'll never see me again." For a moment, Witmore seemed to consider the offer. It would be the simplest solution. Let Harlan disappear into the night and hope that the scandal would die with him. But the plantation owner was too shrewd to let such a threat to his reputation simply walk away. "Oh, you'll leave all right," Witmore replied with a cold smile, "but not the way you think." The master's hand moved to the pistol at his hip, but before he could draw it, a new voice cut through the morning air. "Master Witmore! Master Witmore!" Everyone turned to see a young slave boy running toward them from the direction of the quarters, his bare feet splashing through the puddles left by the night's storm. It was little Moses, Samuel's grandson, though Harlan hadn't known of the family connection until now. Moses was perhaps 12 years old, small for his age, but quick and intelligent. He had been born on the plantation and had never known any other life, but he possessed a natural dignity that reminded everyone who saw him of his grandfather. His eyes held the same depth and wisdom that had characterized Samuel, though they were still bright with the innocence of youth. "What is it, boy?" Witmore snapped, annoyed at the interruption. Moses skidded to a halt, his chest heaving from exertion. "Master, the slaves. They're all gathered in the main yard. They're singing, sir. Singing and praying, and they won't go to work." Witmore's face darkened. A work stoppage was every planter's nightmare, a direct challenge to the authority that kept the entire system functioning. Without the labor of enslaved people, the plantation would grind to a halt within days. "What are they singing about?" "About the river, sir. About the 20 who went into the water last night. They're saying—" Moses glanced nervously at Harlan. "They're saying that justice is coming, that the blood of the innocent cries out for vengeance." A chill ran down Harlan's spine. He had seen slave uprisings before, had helped put down more than one rebellion in his time as overseer, but this felt different, not like anger or desperation, but like something deeper and more dangerous. The enslaved people weren't just angry about the deaths, they were responding to the revelation of Harlan's true parentage and the implications of what that meant. The songs that Moses described were not random expressions of grief, but carefully chosen spirituals that carried coded messages. Justice is coming could mean many things: divine retribution, earthly rebellion, or simply the hope that truth would eventually prevail over lies. "Get back to the quarters," Witmore ordered Moses. "Tell them that anyone not at work in 10 minutes will feel the lash." But as the boy ran off, they could all hear it, the sound of voices raised in song, carrying across the plantation like a funeral dirge. It was a sound that spoke of grief and rage, and a reckoning that had been building for generations. The melody was hauntingly beautiful, but the words carried an undertone of defiance that made Witmore's men shift uncomfortably in their saddles. The song was "Go Down, Moses," a spiritual that had become associated with resistance and the hope of freedom. The enslaved people were not just mourning their dead, they were making a statement about their humanity and their right to justice. Witmore turned back to Harlan, his hand still on his pistol. "This is your fault, your weakness, your contamination has infected my property. They're getting ideas above their station." "Maybe they should have ideas," Harlan said quietly. "Maybe they should know that they're human beings, not property." The words were out before he could stop them, and he saw Witmore's face go purple with rage. But Harlan found that he didn't care anymore. For 28 years, he had lived a lie, believing himself to be something he wasn't. Now, for the first time, he was speaking his truth. "You ungrateful bastard," Witmore snarled. "I took you in when your whore mother died. I gave you a position, a purpose, a life better than you deserved. And this is how you repay me." The insult to his mother's memory sparked something in Harlan that he hadn't felt in years: righteous anger. Elena Blackwood had been a good woman who had made impossible choices in an impossible situation. She had sacrificed everything to protect her son, and she deserved better than to be remembered as a whore. "By becoming a monster?" Harlan asked, his voice rising. "By killing innocent people to protect your profits? If that's what you call repayment, then I want no part of it." Witmore drew his pistol, the metal gleaming in the morning light. "You've forgotten your place, boy. Time to remind you." But before he could pull the trigger, the sound of singing grew louder, and they could see a crowd of enslaved people approaching from the quarters. They weren't running or shouting. They were walking slowly, deliberately, their voices raised in harmony as they sang an old spiritual about crossing over Jordan. The sight was both beautiful and terrifying. Nearly 100 people moved as one, their voices creating a wall of sound that seemed to shake the very foundations of the plantation. At their head walked an elderly woman named Mama Celia, Samuel's sister and the unofficial leader of the slave community. Mama Celia was small and bent with age, but her eyes burned with a fire that made even Witmore's men step back. She had been on the plantation for 40 years, arriving as a young woman and watching as generations of her people lived and died under the whip. She had buried children and grandchildren, had seen families torn apart by sale, and had endured horrors that would have broken a lesser spirit. But she had also seen moments of grace and redemption, times when the human spirit had triumphed over oppression. And now, looking at the broken man who had been her people's tormentor, she saw an opportunity for something that rarely occurred in their world: genuine transformation. "Master Witmore," she called out, her voice carrying clearly across the distance, "we come to talk about justice." "Get back to your quarters!" Witmore shouted, waving his pistol. "All of you! This is not your concern!" But Mama Celia kept walking, and the crowd followed her. There were perhaps 100 people in total, men, women, and children, all united in their grief and their determination. They moved with the slow, inexorable power of a river, and nothing Witmore could say or do seemed capable of stopping them. 20 of our people died last night," Mama Celia said when she was close enough to speak normally. 20 souls sent to their rest by that man's hand. She pointed at Harlan. "But we know the truth now. We know who he really is." Harlan felt his heart sink. If the slaves knew about his parentage, then his secret was already spreading beyond the plantation. There would be no containing it now, and the consequences would be swift and brutal. "We know he's Samuel's boy," Mama Celia continued, her voice carrying to every person present. "We know he's our blood, turned against us by lies and hatred. But we also know that blood calls to blood, and that even the lost can find their way home." She turned to look directly at Harlan, and in her eyes he saw not hatred but something he had never expected: forgiveness. It was a gift he didn't deserve, a grace that seemed to come from some source beyond human understanding. "Samuel told me about you before he went to the river," she said softly. "Told me how he'd watched you grow up, how he'd prayed every night that you'd find your way back to who you really are. He died believing that redemption was possible, even for you." The words hit Harlan like a physical blow, and he fell to his knees in the mud, overwhelmed by the weight of her forgiveness. "I don't deserve it," he whispered. "I've done terrible things. I've killed your people, your family." "Yes, you have," Mama Celia agreed, her voice gentle but firm. "And you'll carry that burden for the rest of your days. But Samuel's blood runs in your veins, and that blood is good blood. It's never too late to choose who you want to be." Witmore had heard enough. "This ends now," he screamed, raising his pistol toward the crowd. "I'll not have my property dictating terms to me." But as he pulled the trigger, Harlan threw himself forward, knocking his former master's arm aside. The shot went wide, the bullet burying itself harmlessly in a nearby tree. The two men struggled in the mud, Witmore's superior size and weight giving him the advantage, but Harlan fought with the desperation of a man who had finally found something worth fighting for. "You're finished, boy," Witmore gasped as they rolled in the dirt. "Even if you kill me, they'll hunt you down like a dog." "Maybe," Harlan replied, managing to get his hands around the pistol. "But at least I'll die as myself, not as the lie you made me." The gun went off again, and Witmore's body went limp. Harlan rolled away, breathing hard, and looked down at the man who had shaped his life for so many years. There was no satisfaction in the killing, only a profound sense of emptiness and the knowledge that there was no going back. Witmore's men had their weapons drawn, but they were outnumbered and surrounded. The enslaved people had formed a circle around them, not threatening but implacable in their determination. The balance of power had shifted, and everyone present could feel it. "What happens now?" Jake Morrison asked nervously, his pistol shaking in his hand. Harlan stood up slowly, the smoking pistol still in his hand. He looked around at the faces surrounding him, faces that had once looked at him with fear and hatred, but now showed something different. Not trust, exactly, but possibility. "Now we choose," he said quietly. "All of us. We can keep living the lie. Keep pretending that some people are worth more than others because of the color of their skin. Or we can try to build something better." He turned to Mama Celia, his voice breaking with emotion. "I can't undo what I've done. I can't bring back the people I killed. But if you'll have me, I'd like to try to make amends." The old woman studied him for a long moment, her weathered face reflecting decades of wisdom and pain. Then she nodded slowly, and Harlan felt something inside him begin to heal. "Samuel always said that a man's worth isn't measured by his mistakes, but by what he does after he realizes he's made them. You've got a lot of work ahead of you, boy. A lot of pain to heal, a lot of trust to earn." "I know," Harlan said, and for the first time in years he felt something that might have been hope. "And I'm ready to do whatever it takes." As the sun rose higher over the plantation, casting long shadows across the muddy ground, a new chapter began. It would not be easy. There would be pursuit, danger, and the constant struggle to build something good from the ashes of something evil. But for the first time in his life, Harlan Blackwood was free to choose his own path. The river still flowed past the plantation, carrying with it the memory of 20 souls who had died for the crime of being born into bondage, but it also carried the promise of redemption, the hope that even the darkest sins could be washed clean by the waters of genuine repentance. Samuel's sacrifice had not been in vain. His son had finally come home. This story reminds us that our choices define us more than our circumstances. No matter how dark the path we've walked, redemption is always possible for those brave enough to seek it. If this story moved you, please like this video, subscribe to our channel, and share it with someone who needs to hear this message. Your support helps us bring more powerful stories like this to light. What did you think of Harlan's journey? Do you believe redemption is possible for everyone? Let us know in the comments below. We read every single one. Until next time, remember, we all have the power to choose who we become.